Today, we are going to unpack one of the biggest, and maybe one of the most important stories in the entire global economy. It's the story of how the U.S. Federal Reserve wound up with a $9 trillion balance sheet, and why it's a trap they can't seem to escape. Just look at this number for a second. That's a 9 with 12 zeros after it. $9 trillion. It's a number so huge it's almost meaningless, right? It feels completely unreal. But it is very, very real, and it's sitting at the very center of our financial world. So let's try to put that in perspective. What does $9 trillion even mean? Well, it's 16 times the entire annual budget of India. It's bigger than the economies of Germany and Japan combined. It's about 40% of the whole U.S. economy for an entire year. It is a staggering amount of money. But the real problem isn't just the size of the number.
The real problem is how we got here and why it's become this trap that seems impossible to get out of. You see, the entire system has become an addict, completely hooked on free money. And now withdrawal feels like it could break everything. To understand why, we have to go back in time.
And it all starts right here, with the ghost of the Great Depression. Believe it or not, the decisions being made by the Fed today are a direct response to a massive mistake that happened almost 100 years ago. See, when a stock market crashed back in 1929, it didn't have to turn into the Great Depression. The real disaster happened because the Federal Reserve at the time did, well, basically nothing. They just sat and watched as panic spread, as people ran on the banks, and as the amount of money in the economy just evaporated. The result? Thousands of banks failed, unemployment hit 25%, and the economy completely collapsed. Now, here's the kicker. The guy who would eventually become the Fed chairman in 2008, Ben Bernanke, actually wrote his PhD thesis on this very topic. He proved that the Fed's inaction was the fatal error. So when he was faced with his own massive crisis in '08, he was absolutely haunted by one thought. Whatever happens, we cannot repeat the mistake of 1929. And that brings us to the 2008 financial crisis and the birth of a brand new and pretty radical economic weapon. That weapon was called Quantitative Easing. You've probably heard it called QE. It sounds super complicated, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. The central bank, the Fed, would basically just create new money out of thin air, just digitally, on a computer, and use it to buy things like government bonds. So let's break that down. How does this actually work? First, the Fed just creates digital dollars. Second, they use those dollars to buy bonds from commercial banks. This floods the banking system with a whole lot of new cash, which does two crucial things. It pushes interest rates way, way down close to zero, and it encourages those banks to lend all that new cash out. The whole goal was to make borrowing so dirt cheap that people and businesses would just keep spending, and we'd avoid that 1929-style collapse. And here was the promise, the one they made over and over. This is just a temporary emergency measure. Once the crisis is over, they said, we'll sell all these bonds back, that digital money will disappear, and everything will go back to normal. That was the plan anyway.
But that temporary emergency measure, well, it pretty quickly became a permanent addiction. The market got totally hooked on that cheap money, and as it turns out, it just couldn't quit.
And you can literally see this addiction playing out on this timeline. In 2013, the Fed just hinted that they might slow down the money printing, and the global markets threw a massive fit, the taper tantrum. Then, in 2018, the new Fed chair, Jerome Powell, actually tried to reverse course and shrink the balance sheet. What happened? The market had its worst December crash since the Great Depression. So Powell was forced into what they call the Powell pivot. He surrendered, he gave up, and he started cutting interest rates again. The market sent a very clear message. We can't function without your help. And then 2020 happened. When the pandemic shut down the entire world, the Fed didn't just turn the money printer back on. They cranked it up to a level nobody had ever seen before. It was a complete money tsunami. I mean, just look at this chart. In just a few weeks, the Fed printed trillions of dollars. Get this, they bought more government debt in 6 weeks than they had in the entire previous decade. The balance sheet didn't just grow, it exploded. It more than doubled, from $4 trillion all the way up to that $9 trillion number we started with. So what happens when all that new money starts chasing the same amount of stuff? Well, you get what people started calling the everything bubble. Housing prices just shot up over 40% in 2 years. The stock market doubled.
Crypto went to the moon. Even things like used cars and luxury watches, their prices went crazy. It created this illusion that everyone was getting rich, but really, it was just a whole lot more currency flooding the system.
And that brings us to where we are right now, what looks like the Fed's inevitable endgame, because they are well and truly 100% trapped. So here's the dilemma. They're now stuck between a rock and a hard place, with two terrible choices. Look at this. Option 1, they finally do what they promised, and they shrink the balance sheet, they stop the flow of cheap money. Well, that would almost certainly cause interest rates to spike, which would crash the stock market and probably the whole economy. Okay, so what about option 2? They just keep printing money to keep everything propped up. Well, that leads to soaring inflation, which destroys the value of the dollar and crushes the savings of everyday people. So, a crash or runaway inflation? Neither of those sounds very good, does it?
And a decade of this free money created a really dangerous side effect, something called zombie companies. These are businesses that are basically the walking dead of the economy. They don't make enough profit to even pay the interest on their loans. They only stay alive by taking out new, cheap loans to pay off the old ones. And here's the truly shocking part. Today, these zombies make up 40% of all small and mid-sized companies in the US.
And you can see the real-world consequences of this everywhere. Just take a look at Boeing, right? Once this icon of American engineering. Between 2013 and 2019, they borrowed and spent $40 billion, but not on safety, not on quality control, not on R&D. No, they spent it buying back their own stock to pump up the share price. This wasn't just an engineering failure. It was a total failure of how to use capital, and it was directly encouraged by a world of free money.
But you know who the biggest addict of all is? The US government itself. We've hit a point called fiscal dominance, where the government's debt is so huge that the Fed basically loses its independence. And check this out. This is a terrifying milestone. For the first time in history, the US government now spends more money just paying the interest on its old debt than it does on its entire national defense budget. The past is literally eating the future. Now, if you look at history, when a country gets this deep in debt, there are really only 3 ways out. First, austerity. You drastically cut spending. That's pretty much political suicide, so that's out. Second, a hard default. You just announce you can't pay your debts. For the country with the world's reserve currency, that's geopolitically impossible. So that leaves path number 3, the soft default. You promise to pay back every single dollar, but you do it by printing new money, which makes the money itself worth less. You inflate your way out of debt. And history shows that governments almost always choose path number 3. It's the path of least resistance.
And this leads us to the new reality we're all living in. The old idea of getting a safe, guaranteed, risk-free return on your money by just buying government bonds, that's over. That era is gone. We've entered a new one, the era of return-free risk. That means that even the safest investments now carry the huge, hidden risk of being paid back with money that's become worthless.
It seems like the only tool left in the toolbox is that money printer, and they're going to keep using it until it breaks, which leaves every single one of us with the most important question of all. In this strange new era, how do you actually protect your wealth?